Okay, so here we are working on step 3. We're on our third example. And you can see that I've created a text box and I have included the entire argument in the text box so that I can just have it there at my ready. It's easier to look through it, work through it when it's just there in a complete text box. So there's the whole argument. And the first thing I'm going to do is create a text box and copy into that text box the conclusion that we determined, we isolated and paraphrased back in step 2. I'm just going to copy it right in there and clean it up a little bit. Let's make that a little bigger and take off that quotation mark, give it a number. As usual, we'll call the conclusion number 1. And I'm going to put it right over here at the top of the page, knowing that that's what all of the premises that I find are going to lead to. All the claims that are made in this argument are going to give evidence for that claim. It's what the author wants me to believe or wants me to accept if, in fact, the argument is successful. Now, there's going to be several premises, I'm sure, so I'm just going to double click this box and make a few. I don't know how many they're going to be. Let's start with 4. It's not a huge argument, but you never know. I'm going to remember to number them to make sure they're in order. So I'm just going to start from the beginning and look for individual claims. You want to remember that each premise needs to be a single assertion, something that can be denied or affirmed, and one claim. Sometimes we find many claims in one sentence. Sometimes we find 3 sentences that really are communicating a single idea. You want to feel free to paraphrase, but you want to keep your focus on being accurate and fair to the argument as given to you. Okay, so the first premise that I find is in the first sentence. The vast majority of serial rapists are also major consumers of pornography. That's a single idea. It could be affirmed or denied, and the author is using it to convince me of something else. Okay, what? I'm not exactly sure of just yet. I'm just going to keep going and looking for some other premises. Okay, next one. These rapists often act out scenes that they have witnessed in pornography, videos, or texts. So it's another claim about what rapists do. Look at the difference between these. These are very different claims. Premise number 2, the vast majority of serial rapists also consume pornography. 2, they often act out scenes. Okay, let's keep going. In the next sentence, this clearly shows that pornography makes people into violent criminals. That's a single idea. And in fact, that this clearly shows isn't the claim that I'm looking for. The claim is that pornography makes people into violent criminals. But the this clearly shows is a good hint that there's evidence working here, that these 2 claims, premises 2 and 3, are giving evidence for 4. So I'm going to put them over here. This is the way I like to do it. When I find a sub-argument, I like to just figure it out right then, even if I know I got to go back and find some other premises. And even if I know, sometimes I find out that I'm wrong and I have to go back and redo it. But when I'm like, oh, I see some evidence working, I'd like to get it down. Okay. So the question is, how are 2 and 3 giving evidence for 4? Are 2 and 3 independent of each other, or are 2 or 3 dependent on each other? Well, let's look. Let's say that it's false. Let's say someone comes out and says, actually, there's a new study that falsifies premise number 2. The vast majority of serial rapers also are not major consumers of pornography. I don't want to ask whether 2 being false makes 3 false. I want to ask whether 3 can still function as evidence. Does 3 matter if 2 is false? These rapists often act out scenes that they have witnessed in pornography, videos, or texts. Okay, even if the vast majority of serial rapists are not consumers of pornography, it still may be the case that rapists can act out scenes that they have witnessed, even if it's not the case that a lot of them do it. So I think these are independent, although I think there's some room for disagreement on that. I might want to keep thinking about that. But I think they are 2 different reasons to believe that pornography makes people into violent criminals. If 3 is falsified, if it turns out that rapists don't act out scenes, still, you could use the claim, and we're not arguing whether it's a good piece of evidence. We're arguing that this could still be intended, premise number 2 could be intended to function as evidence for number 4. So I think that's the way I'm going to go with that. Someone may disagree with me and say, those are too dependent because how could they act out scenes if they haven't been major consumers of pornography? But I think they still could, or at least some of them still could. All right, I'm going to go over here, look for any other premises. This clearly shows that pornography makes people into violent criminals, and for this reason it should be banned immediately. Well, the last phrase of that sentence is my conclusion. So now that I think about it, I'm not sure there aren't any stated premises. But let me look at 4. Let me look how 4 is functioning. Pornography makes people into violent criminals. Therefore, pornography ought to be banned. I'm sure 4 is intended to give evidence for 1. I know that. But I think it needs another claim. I think there's an unstated premise here. Let me throw one down and see if it works. Anything that makes people into violent criminals ought to be banned. My strong suspicion is that 4 needs an unstated premise in order to allow it to serve. So, say you accept 4, pornography makes people into violent criminals. How does that give evidence to the claim that pornography ought to be banned? What other claim needs to be functioning, even if it's unstated? And remember, the fact that a premise is unstated says nothing about the quality of the argument. Well, you need to believe that anything that makes people into violent criminals ought to be banned. That connects the idea that's in premise 4 to the idea that's in the conclusion. If either of these are false, the other one can't function. Say someone says, you know what, it's just not true. Premise number 4 is just not true. Pornography doesn't make people into violent criminals. Well, then the fact that anything that makes people into violent criminals ought to be banned can't be used to ban pornography, because pornography doesn't do what 5 is talking about. If 5 is false, no, it's not true that anything that turns people into violent criminals ought to be banned, then the fact that pornography makes people into violent criminals doesn't give evidence to the fact that it should be banned. So these two are dependent. I'm going to link them up here, and then I'm going to draw an arrow to that. Now, I do want to point out that I think the dependent nature of premise 4 and 5 is less controversial than the independent nature of premise 2 and 3. So it's a tricky thing about doing diagrams. A lot of the times there's multiple right answers that reasonable people can disagree about. And sometimes there just is a right answer that all reasonable people should agree on. The best protection against that ambiguity is to make sure you're thinking through your decisions as best as you can and that you're able to back them up. That's not a guarantee. Sometimes I think through my decisions really well. Someone else comes along, makes me see them in a different way that I think is actually more accurate, more fair, and then I change my diagram, change my perception of the argument. That happens too. But right now, I think this is a really good, clear diagram of this argument. It contains all the premises that the author is using, and the relationships make sense. So that's a good step 3 on example number 3.